Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Capital Compounder Show. This is episode 7. Today, our guest is Larry MacDonald. Larry is a journalist and columnist who works for the Globe and Mail. And he was running for the longest time a column called Me and My Money. And Larry actually featured me, I think, once or twice in that column. It was lots of fun, where as a do-it-yourself investor, you get to reveal your strategy, your process for picking stocks, and your key holdings in your portfolio. It was a lot of fun meeting Larry. That was what I woke up to and looked forward to every Saturday when my father subscribed to the Globe and Mail newspaper. It was always fun catching up and reading about different investors out there. So welcome to the show, Larry.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we were just talking before the show, Larry, and you mentioned that now you've moved on to a column called TFSA Trouncers. And I think there's some success stories out there, people who invested in their TFSA and have grown them into, I think, $1 million plus. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, less than 1% of TFSA investors, I'd say. Very small group.
And Larry, you have previously published books on Bombardier and Nortel, I believe in the 2000s. And your most recent book launch, which will be the focus of our conversation today, is The Shopify Story. And I believe that came out in October of this year, 2024. So tell me, what inspired you to write about Shopify?
Well, I'm an economist, right? So these kind of things interest me. I was just curious how Shopify was able to grow so much and become successful. And I also thought there could be some lessons and insights there for other people, especially entrepreneurs and policymakers, so forth. So it could be a useful book to many people. Um, but I also wrote the book because I want to see more entrepreneurs in the world. As an economist, I know how important they are to growing the economy. And indeed, the last 2 centuries, we've enjoyed this progress in our living standards, mainly because of entrepreneurs commercializing a lot of new technologies and innovations.
Absolutely. And especially when we want to see more entrepreneurs start up and flourish in Canada itself. I'm sure you'd agree with
Yeah,
that. And Toby, who is the founder and CEO of Shopify, is basically our poster boy, right, for a very successful entrepreneur who started the company in Ottawa, Canada, and just grown it into a multi-billion-dollar multinational company that so many retailers and other entrepreneurs rely on as their platform to sell products and I think services now.
that's right.
So in your journey researching Shopify, I know there's a lot of public information out there, but I'm sure you're thinking, okay, what else can I pull into the book? Interesting stories, meeting some of the early employees. Um, in that journey, did you end up meeting Toby, the founder himself?
Well, the way I usually do a book is, first I do a lot of research for like 2 or 3 months just to find out everything I can about our company. And the interesting thing was, in that process, I discovered there were like dozens of podcasts, interviews of Shopify executives online. And I learned a great deal from those. So when it came time for me to do the interviews with the executives, I had pretty well all my questions answered. And, uh, and I didn't really need to do the interviews, to tell you the truth, but I still asked as a courtesy if they would be interested. Um, and what happened was I, I sort of was left in limbo for a while. I got neither a yes or no answer. And I think it was because it was kind of a bad time for Shopify. It was when the stock was crashing and they had laid off, thousands of people. And so it was very stressful. The press coverage of Shopify was pretty negative. And me being a journalist, I wonder if they thought maybe, they should be somewhat wary of the interviews. So I didn't get a chance to interview Toby, but I did get a chance to talk to some of the directors on the board there, which kind of was interesting and helped.
And who are some of those directors you talked to?
They've asked to remain, private, unfortunately.
And through that primary research and in talking to some of those directors, what were some interesting new facts you were able to uncover?
Yeah, what really surprised me most was learning about Tobi Lütke's youth. Toby being the CEO of Shopify, he's a pretty important person in the story. So I was, digging into his past, his youth, and it was kind of like the childhood of a person, least likely to succeed. It was pretty amazing the transformation he went through. When he was young, he was a poor student, and just getting by with the least amount of grades that would get him passed to the and into the next grade. His parents actually thought he had ADHD, and he was medicated for a time. He developed an addiction to computer games, which most parents totally dread. And he left school actually after grade 10, early dropout. Then he became a programmer, and his first job he got an unsatisfactory rating from his employer. And here we think, Toby's such a good programmer, and he is. But at the time he was playing computer games at night, so he's totally exhausted during the day. And then finally, he ended up working, you won't believe this, as a coder for a company in the porn industry. He doesn't talk about it too much, but there is evidence that he was in the industry. If you go on to, I think it's there's a hacker forum where only programmers exchange messages. And so, that that kind of background doesn't really suggest
No, it's
that
such
he's
an
going to
unlikely
end.
story, right? Of someone who built one of the world's most successful tech
Mhm.
companies. That's really interesting. And is it true that he found the niche because he wanted to sell snowboards, was it, online, and he couldn't
Online and he
find a
couldn't find a
platform to sell?
platform to sell?
Uh, yes, yeah. He came to Canada when he was about 20, around 2002. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you okay,
Yeah.
Larry. Yep.
Um, because he had a girlfriend in Canada, uh, and he wanted to hang out with her. And he had a remote job at the time. Someone in Germany was employing him, but it sort of dried up, and he became unemployed. But the thing was, he couldn't get a job in Canada because he didn't have the papers. He didn't have the visa or the permits. So he went in. He became an entrepreneur because there's no requirements for that. And he first tried selling snowboards online, but then he realized there was a pretty good opportunity in developing a software to let other people set up online stores, because the state of the art at the time was very bad. Most of the software, you had to be a coder to set it up, and you couldn't customize it very well. So it was just atrocious. And Toby thought he could do it better. He could make you know a platform where you didn't need to know coding to set up an online store, and you could also customize it more. And that's what that's how Shopify was born, basically that way.
And who was there from day one, Larry? Like, who was on his team? Does he count anyone as a co-founder?
Oh yes, there was two other co-founders. One was his friend from Germany, and the other one was a VC guy who used to dine at the house where Toby was living with his girlfriend. Um, the interesting thing about this period, though, was actually, and what made a lot of it possible was his the parents of his girlfriend. Basically, he lived in their house while he was setting up Shopify for a good long time, from about 2004 to 2014, which is like about 10 years. So for that length of time, he depended upon their support, and it was a big factor in how Shopify came about. So I think that should be mentioned. But the co-founders, one was into business development, and the other one was a techie himself, and he sort of helped make the whole thing more user friendly. Why Shopify is so easy to use.
Great. So he had the sales guy, he had the architect who could help make the solution more stable, add features. Toby was obviously the visionary. But you can build a platform, but you need people to come, right? And to use it, sign up, subscribe, become paying customers. How did he go to market? What was the strategy in the very beginning?
Okay, well, he sort of stumbled on a few things here. When he was building Shopify, he was also a member of an open source community. And he actually set up a blogging platform for that community. He had 10,000 people linking to his own blog. And as he went along developing Shopify, he would post updates, right? So he had, in effect, this audience on the sidelines that could become, potential first adopters, really, and which turned out to be the case. Also, his friend Daniel from Germany had his own blog, and he attracted clients as well. So the other thing too was at that time it was very easy to use Google Ads. In fact, Toby says he was about the only one advertising in this space at the time. So and it was very cheap, and he got a really good response that way. And so it was things took off pretty easily at the beginning for him.
Well, was there a key moment that he would describe, or what you found in your research, that was like a turning point for him early on, where he thought, okay, this is a viable business. I'm going to keep on going. I'm going to pour everything into this.
Not at first. As a matter of fact, in about the second year, Shopify almost went bankrupt because they had a pricing model which encouraged very small companies to register, and they didn't have very much in the way of sales. Yet, Toby had to hire staff to administer these accounts, to set them up and so forth. So at a certain point, his payroll was outrunning his revenues. And at one point, he was mainly about 2 months away from calling it quits, really. It was almost that bad. But then his father-in-law, by that time he had married his girlfriend, and his father-in-law stepped in and gave him a loan to tide him over. And shortly after, he got his first angel investor, and from then on, it was up and away. But I think what really told Toby that he had a business was approximately like in 2008, we had this huge financial crisis, if you remember, and a pretty sharp, deep recession. And everybody in business was, their business was plummeting and going downhill. But Shopify actually picked up a lot because, when you get laid off, you're spending a lot of time at home and you think, hey, why don't I start a business online, right? So got a lot of people that way, but also a lot of companies had expensive e-commerce operations, and they knew Shopify would be a lot cheaper, so they switched over. So Shopify actually became profitable during the worst of time, for most other businesses. Um, it became profitable. So by 2009 and 2010, uh, Toby decided that, hey, I have a growth company here, and he started looking at growth opportunities and venture capital.
That's a pivotal moment, right? Like, as many companies are going out of business, yours becomes viable during that time. Sure, that was an epiphany and gave him the motivation to press on. What was the first major, I guess, retailer or brand to sign on to the Shopify platform?
It was a company in Nova Scotia, if I remember correctly, that sold uh, sort of like storage containers. um, but actually, one of the first to sign on was Harley Finkelstein, who is now the
Who's
president
now
of
the president?
Shopify.
Tell me that story.
Well, Harley, he was a born entrepreneur, and during university, that's pretty well how he paid his way through. Is he had a clothing business, uh, and that got him through financially. So after he graduated from Concordia in Montreal, he went and got his law degree at Ottawa U, and that's where he met Toby and discovered this online platform. So he set up there too. He was, I don't know, about the 100th customer. So he started selling his T-shirts from there, uh, and then he was taking law at Ottawa U, and then he went to Article in Toronto, but he didn't like it, so he came back and asked Toby if he could work for him, and Toby said yeah. And so Harley took over the business development side of Shopify, and he was a pretty dynamic individual. They call him the power extrovert. He's just built for that kind of work, going out and showing up business. So he was a very important addition to Shopify.
He's doing a phenomenal job, and being one of the early employees, he's grown with the company, and continues to transform it. Can you talk about some of the other early employees, like employees 1 through 100, and if they're still there? Are there any notable stories? I'm sure if they gained equity early on, they're probably doing very well now.
Certainly, yes, yes. Well, his friend from Germany, Daniel, uh, he certainly did very well. He, I don't know, I think he's worth several $100 million. He has this mansion in Rockcliffe, which is, the toniest enclave in Ottawa right now. He also, he's turned into a real fanatical poker player. He goes to Las Vegas all the time. I'm not sure if he loses a lot or wins a lot, but sometimes you need a lot of money to go there. Uh, the other person who was there from the beginning was uh, this guy from Perth, just south of Ottawa. His first name was Toby as well, and his last name was Shannon. He handled client services for Shopify, and he was very good at it. This client services was called the secret growth hack of Shopify at the time. He left the company in 2022, and I'm sure he's worth several $100 million as well. And then who else was there? Oh, there's Craig Miller from Toronto. He handled marketing. He left in 2020, and yeah, all these guys have like their own foundations now. They've made so much money, they've put it into foundations, and they're using it for good causes, good, charities and things like that. And plus, they invest a lot in, startup companies as well. They really support a lot of new businesses with their money. So, not only are they enjoying the good life, but they're also doing these other good things on the side.
It's almost reminiscent, Larry, of what's called the PayPal Mafia, right? The guys who started up PayPal and, of course, went on to parlay those windfalls into other companies, and they're
Well,
getting
there's
some are
also
getting into politics. Yeah,
and there's also a thing called the Shopify Mafia, which is like hundreds of Shopify former employees who are out there investing in all these startups and actually starting their own too.
exactly. It's a similar effect, right? It's a similar ecosystem, which is amazing. So Toby's basically started and built his business in his in-laws' house. But there's a time when, okay, this business is getting big. We're outgrowing my in-laws' house. So walk me through that journey on his ability to scale this company.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, actually. Like these executives are young guys in their 20s, and most of them are like techies. They spent time in front of computers, and and they weren't at all experienced in being executives or managers. And here they had this huge surge of growth. So one of the things they did was they brought in coaches. Uh, these would be people, senior executives that have retired from major U.S. corporations, IBM and all that. And Toby says that was like a key factor in how they're able to cope with the scaling up.
And was that Toby's idea, or did someone put that idea in his head?
No, it
The
was
hired coaches.
originally adopted by another executive, the chief technical officer. He started it, and then when Toby and Harley saw that, they went for it, and they extended that. They broadened that out to many coaches, and they brought them in house. They called it the talent acceleration team, and so most of the employees in Shopify had access to that, and that in itself was important in that it helped a lot of the staff to grow into their roles and become, to cope with the growth.
And
So,
in scaling and hiring hundreds of employees at such a rapid pace, what was Toby's hiring philosophy early on? Who is he selecting in the market to join his company to build?
well, yeah, you've touched on probably one of the more critical aspects that accounts for Shopify's success, and that's its recruitment policy. So the way Shopify hired was it looked for people who had entrepreneurial uh, inclinations or experience. They were self-starters because Shopify didn't have a lot of procedures or rules. You just had a culture, and that culture depended on people being self-starters. They took matters into their own hands and they initiated things. So the interview process, an important part of it was the life story, and they're looking for people who would have episodes of organizing something like starting some kind of a charity or whatever. They didn't want people who played tennis. They wanted the founder of the tennis club. So they had all these individuals they didn't need a lot of rules and regulations. They were just totally into getting the work done, right? So, but on top of that, for the senior roles like product managers and such, they like to hire a lot of founders of startups. A lot of them were ex-founders who had failed, but they found that these guys were pretty good because they had something to prove, and they had the experience of running a startup, but they wanted to prove they could do it. And the other way they got founders was through a process that's called acqui-hiring. And what that means is they would go and acquire startups, the whole lot, the founder and the employees, and bring them inside Shopify and basically set them loose as if they were still a startup, but supported by Shopify. So basically, you could say Shopify was a collection of startups, and that's how it managed to maintain this kind of culture as it scaled up. It didn't have to go to a lot of rules, regulations, and so forth. It could just rely on people, using their own initiative to get things done. So it was quite a different environment, a bit chaotic at times, a lot of mistakes, but it moved fast. And they got a lot done. And it was very productive. So it worked out. And so the recruitment aspect was very important to what happened at Shopify, in my opinion.
So during the phase in which he's scaling, he's moved out of his in-laws, he's scaling the business, he has his headquarters now in Ottawa. What are some of the bold decisions that Toby makes that are just building on the success?
Well, I wouldn't say Toby makes bold decisions because he has more of an engineering approach to the company. He's very careful in when he starts. He, for example, if he's thinking of entering some kind of a niche in the market, he does a lot of testing, a lot of interviews to gain some kind of confirmation of that. And he doesn't act until he gets a very clear, sign that, hey, there's something there. He also, he gets a lot of feedback from his merchants, his customers. Either he asks for it or he gets it whether or not he asks for it. And that's been quite useful for him in terms of making decisions. But generally, he doesn't take really bold, uncalculated risks. It's very controlled, very engineering-like, I would say.
And who did Toby look up to in building the business? Like if we're talking about other successful business people around the world, did he model his company
Oh,
or
yeah,
model his
yeah.
leadership style off of certain people?
Yeah, like definitely when he was apprenticing to be a programmer, um, he was very impressed with his supervisor in Germany. He was in his 50s. Toby was like 17, and he's a bit of a, drove a motorcycle and wore a leather jacket, whereas everyone in Germany was wearing suits and this and that. So he was like a very plain speaker. He had no inhibitions about calling people out on things, and people tolerated that in his case because he was usually right. He's one of those guys who, if you said something you're doing was wrong, you knew it was wrong, and that's kind of describes what Toby's like with his staff too. He's very frank. Uh, you know, he wants to make sure things are done correctly, and just like his model there. Um, but the other thing, there's many other ways uh, he was influenced by his supervisor there, and another one was his supervisor would put Toby into situations he was not used to. For example, he would take Toby to a sales meeting and then just drop him off with a company to do sales, which Toby, had never done, and he was just always in front of a computer.
Out of Toby's wheelhouse, right? This is an uncomfortable
Yeah.
situation for him. Yeah.
So he would put people into uncomfortable situations as a way for them to grow, because if the situation turns out well, you feel like you've progressed and you're a different person. You're more confident doing these other things as well. So Toby liked to do that with his employees as well. He'd like to try and make them better by challenging them and putting them into uncomfortable situations.
And during that rapid build phase, I'll call them the middle years, I guess. What challenges did the company face, and how did Toby overcome them to continue to grow? I'm sure there's competitive challenges, et cetera, maybe with the back end, trying to onboard so many new retailers at once, right? Throughout the year, it probably came with challenges in terms of server and everything. And can you talk to that?
Well, one challenge was with the coding they had done up to 2010. Toby had all these ideas for growth, but the software package they had was just built for online companies, right? So they had to go through an extensive upgrade, and it actually ended up taking 3 years. And then they had to redo it because it was not working right. So that was a bit of a hard time, a difficult time getting that to work. And when they finally did get it to work, it was what enabled Toby to expand out into all these different features now on the program. And it's fortunate that he had a lot of financing, I would say. He had a lot of, the venture capitalists came through with a lot of money that let him do this. And especially after he finally got the platform going, he had a lot of money to spend on further upgrading it. Because by that time, a lot of his rivals had sort of almost gained market share because Toby was still struggling with this software program.
Rebuilding the code base. And at that time, who were his main competitors?
Well, there's many of them. Big Commerce was one. eBay was one, of course. And of course, Amazon. There's many. There's like hundreds, really, of these platforms. Most of them are very small.
And did any? I'm thinking Amazon. Did any? I haven't read up on this. Come knocking on Toby's door, right? Hey, like we want to give you an offer to buy Shopify and fold it into our own company or merge.
Yes, he got a lot of offers, but he turned them all down. Because Toby was on a mission. He said many times before that he wants to build a 100-year-old company, and he's challenged by his goal to make a world-class company. That's what he enjoys doing, is trying to develop a company that is going to be one of the best, so that when he looks back in his old age, he'll feel that he did a good job. So, like, he's worth billions of dollars, but what really interests him, what he really likes doing, is running this company to see how good he can make it. So he's always trying to come up with original ideas and try new things. He doesn't believe actually in best practices, really, because if you do best practices, you'll just be as good as everybody else, right? Well, he wants to go beyond that and come up with original ideas for making things better, so that he's actually even better than best practices. And this is what motivates Toby a lot.
That's amazing. That drive almost reminds me of Elon Musk, right?
Yeah.
It's that drive for perfection, and he's able to find so many hours in the day to keep on that pursuit. Can you describe the lead up to the IPO?
The IPO, yes. Of course, they got a lot of venture capital, which really helped. Not only in terms of financing, but uh, mentoring too. They
Who are
learned a
the
lot of.
early believers in Toby and Shopify? If you can name some venture capitalists.
Oh, what's the name of one of them? It eludes me at the moment.
Do you remember the name of the firm?
No, I just can't think of it right now.
Okay.
There were several of them actually. Um, One of them was the pension plan for Ontario public servants, and but they're mostly U.S. In origin. But what I was going to say though is these venture capitalists also uh, mentored uh, Toby, gave him a lot of good ideas, and helped him, navigate a lot of things. And like, for example, they came up with, they got Toby to adopt this thing called the compass metric, which is just basically a metric you follow every week to tell you how well you're doing and what you should be doing to advance that. And at the time, Shopify was mainly collecting monthly recurring revenues from subscriptions. So the compass metric was, focused on these recurring revenues, and the target was 3% a week. And so they have a weekly meeting and monitor that. And I think that focus really helped Toby and Shopify get through this period and into the IPO stage.
And the IPO was a massive success, one of the biggest in Canadian history. And then, of course, the pandemic was boom times for Shopify, and they went in the hiring spree. How did you describe the pandemic period in your book?
Well, of course, at first, Shopify was just inundated with business, like everyone's going online. And I think the revenues in 2020 grew by about 80%, just huge. They're just extremely, extremely busy. Um, and that's when they adopted remote working as well, which they still have to this day. But as the pandemic wore on, a lot of um, problems arose with morale within the ranks, I'd say. They had this Slack channel for internal communications, and there's a lot of keyboard warrior type of behavior. Um, a lot of At the time you had things like defund the police, and so a lot of politics is starting to occupy people as they work from home in isolation,
Mm-hmm.
and so the productivity was starting to be affected somewhat, and um, so that wasn't too good. That was very hard for Toby to deal with. He had a lot of turnover as well in his executive team. I think the only executive left from the original group is Harley, and then he had to replace him with a lot of new people as well. So it was sort of a difficult time. In fact, Toby actually mentioned in one podcast that he ended up with a very bad insomnia problem. He couldn't sleep because of all the stress during that period, and he finally got over it and was able to deal with the situation. And as he came out of the pandemic, they started trimming the costs and so forth, and turning the company around.
And one of his bold bets during that time that I think he squashed was the fulfillment business. He wanted to get into a little bit of what Amazon is doing so well. What was his thinking there early days, and how did it end up just failing to launch?
Well, he he didn't realize how difficult it would be. He thought he could just connect a bunch of fulfillment centers with a software network that would improve the flow of shipments. But what happened was he discovered there was a lot of legacy software in those fulfillment centers. And it was very hard trying to integrate with those. So a lot of people left the team. They realized that this wasn't going to work. And then Toby tried to fix problems by acquiring some companies, but that didn't work either. So he actually, and then a lot of people were advising him, well, you got to get rid of this because it's knocking down your margins and distracting you from other things. So eventually, that's what he decided to do. He passed it over to another Flexport fulfillment company. But he invested in that company to maintain some influence or some say in the network. So he didn't completely abandon the project. He was still working through Flexport on this fulfillment network. But now that I hear Flexport itself is sort of struggling a bit with this whole thing. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a bit in limbo whether or not this whole Shopify fulfillment network will work. But but I tell you, when Toby decided to get out of it, it was very therapeutic for the stock price.
Mm-hmm.
The stock price, I think, jumped over 30%, along with some other good news.
Oh yeah, it would have been a big investment, time, resources, capital to get that launched and successful. Um, has his strategy evolved over time? I know that he's doubled down and probably been more on onboarding large retailers onto the platform. Can you describe this next big phase of growth for Shopify?
Oh yeah, like he has many different opportunities here, and of course, expanding up into large companies is one of them. And he's doing it, very well in that niche as well, thanks to his strategy into selling components of his features. For example, Shopify Pay has been very successful in winning customers. But he's also got many other targets to expand into, and one of them is B2B commerce, and another one is international expansion. And by the way, all these market segments that he's going into are actually doing quite well right now. I guess that's why the stock price is doing well too. But there's many other opportunities here in e-commerce. I don't know if you want me to get into them, but there's things like uh, open banking, which is going kind of slow here in Canada because I guess Canadian banks are sort of dragging their feet. But basically, in open banking, that's where a lot of fintech companies will do well if they can have access to customer data. They can do a lot with that and improve the service. Then there's things that are going on in China that are way ahead of North America that Shopify wants to get into. For example, live shopping is really big in China. Also, immersive e-commerce, like things like Roblox. You sell within some kind of a game or whatever to the players. it's just, it's the opportunities are immense. Like e-commerce is projected to, grow by 10% a year for the next easily 10 years. And that's been another factor behind Shopify's success. They've got this great market to tap into, and they're just riding it up higher.
Now, Larry, is there anything that we missed that's just such an interesting story that you want to tell, you put into the book?
Well, I mean, there's so much here. Like, you have to read the book, really. uh,
That's the plug, right? And I'll make the announcement now. So for everyone watching, comment, like, subscribe. I'll be picking a winner, one lucky winner, on December 31st of 2024, and shipping them paperback copy of the Shopify story. So remember, comment, like, subscribe. I'll be picking one winner, and you'll get the paperback book. But Larry, yeah, if there's maybe one more teaser you want to throw into the podcast.
Oh, okay. About Shopify, eh? Well, let me think here. Yeah, so like just maybe a little short summary. As I said earlier, I think one of the key aspects to Shopify's success was its recruitment policy. And it's just an entirely different culture there because of that, and it's contributed to a lot of their success and productivity. The other thing too is you learn, like, you see a lot of merchants on the platform being successful, but many of them actually had to take several tries. Their first few attempts were failures, but they stuck with it and eventually found, the product fit. And that's the great thing about Shopify. It makes the cost of failure very low. Like, you can try many different ideas and it won't cost you very much, because you don't have to put up a lot of capital for, computers, and even you can, like when it comes to shipping and getting products, you can do drop shipping to test out an idea, right? You don't have to commit to any shipments until you verify that there's a product fit. And on top of that, Shopify has a lot of tools for helping you with product fit. They have like A/B testing, so you can experiment with different types of marketing approaches. So what I'm saying here is that, if you want to be an entrepreneur, don't be afraid of failures, because you can keep trying easily, either with or without Shopify. But with Shopify, your cost of failure is very low, so you can keep trying until you find something that works. So I think that's one important thing to mention here. But like I say, there's many others, and I invite all listeners to check out the book.
And having had 2 books published in the early 2000s, and then 20 plus years publishing this book in October 2024, tell us about the changes in the industry, Larry, and getting a book published, all the way to readership and everything, and marketing and all of that.
Well, it's definitely changed a lot. In Canada, it's very hard to be an independent publisher. The exceptions are, our publishers, ECW, but there's been times when even their existence was in question. So it's very, you don't go into publishing in Canada to become rich, that's for sure. The Canadian market is not a big one, so if you're writing for that market, It's not terribly lucrative. So I was, if if you're an author and you want to, do well in terms of royalties, you might want to consider also writing for the U.S. market. Best of all, combine both U.S. and Canadian markets. That's probably one bit of advice I'd pass on to authors. And indeed, that's one reason why I picked Shopify, because Shopify is also very big in the U.S. Very big. But
And tell us about what's next for you then, Larry. Future projects, any future book ideas?
oh yeah, I got many of those, many ideas in mind. The problem is deciding which ones to pursue. That's I find that the more challenging part is deciding. There's actually, if I could, I'd probably have another 5 to 10 books to write, but I don't I don't think I'll get around to that.
If you were to pick one other Canadian or American company that would be the focus of your next book, if it came down to, okay, I only have one more book in me for the next 5 years, who or what would it be?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not thinking so much now about companies because I don't see anything quite like Shopify anymore. For me to do another company book, the requirement would be that it's doing very well, it's growing very well, and there's a lot of coverage in the media, and it's very, it's out there, it's very popular, and so that sort of creates an audience right there for your book. If you write, about any other type of companies, the audience won't be there for it. So what I'm actually thinking about are other interests, like, as you know, I write an investment column, so there's some ideas there. One kind of a weird idea I have for an investment book is it's sort of like a me and my money for uh, famous people from the past, like, you know, uh, the great composers, the great scientists, and all that. And many of them were investors on the side too, and it's quite. I've always found it very interesting to see what they did, and so that's. I don't know. I don't think that'll ever get published. It's probably doesn't have enough of a market, but it's something that really interests me. Another idea, of course, is I'm thinking of expanding out into more of a type of macroeconomic policy type of book. One thing that concerns me is the state of our public administration, which to me is um, probably not performing as well as it should. Could be a lot of waste, and who knows, even misuse of funds there. And I think we're seeing some of that not only right now, but we've seen a lot of it in the past. And there's a lot of good material there, a lot of things to bring up and try and improve upon. So I'm thinking, I'm thinking of doing a book. Might have a title like, The Unwelfare State or something like that. Not the welfare state, the unwelfare state.
That's very catchy. The unwell.
Yeah.
It is unwell. The current state. Well, this has been a great conversation, Larry. It was great catching up. Congrats again to the success of your book, The Shopify Story. And I just want to remind viewers that comment, like, subscribe. I'll be shipping out one paperback copy to the winner that I randomly select. Thanks again, Larry.
Well, thank you, Robin.